Welcome to the Woodstock Social Justice Initiative's second annual John Brown Day celebration and anti-racism conference. My name is Mary Ellen Solon, and I am co-founder of WSJI with Jackie Fisher, Brad Archer, and Sunny Saul.
Excuse me, it's great that you're not using a mic or anything, but it means you have to talk louder.
Thanks. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. We are excited to have you join us and our really remarkable presenters to discuss and act on this year's theme, Creating a Future Beyond Prisons. Before we go on, I'd like to take a pause to reflect on the fact that we are standing on stolen Abenaki land. Pausing, we acknowledge the legacy of white supremacy culture, locally and nationally, honor all those whose struggle provided the foundation for our own social justice work, and orient ourselves to the action we need to commit to today and beyond. We'd like to give a special thanks to Dr. Natalie Batcherville of the Society of Fellows at Dartmouth, as well as Dartmouth's Department of Government for their contributions to today's event. Ooh, Natalie! And we would also like to tell participants that today there is going to be a POC caucus. It's a People of Color caucus that's going to be facilitated by Joellen Mensah. She is the student leader who organized the campaign to have the Black Lives Matters flag raised at Montpelier High School. So she's here to facilitate a discussion for any participants who identify as POC. And that is happening in this area back here, the band room, and will be happening during lunch.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. I'm Jackie Fisher. Welcome. The Woodstock Social Justice Initiative John Brown second annual conference is grassroots and crowdsourced. You all are here because you may have received an email or a friend reached out to you or you saw it on the listserv. So it's something that we're all doing together. I think of you all as participants in this initiative, and I invite you to actively engage with each other and with the speakers, because we're all thinking about how to shift the culture change to one of justice together, right? There are presenters here, there are wonderful presenters that we brought. We're very fortunate to get great people here. There's a lot of interest, and it's about learning and taking it in and then acting. We call it knowing, being, and doing. So that's what I'd like to engage you all around that. That's why we created this kind of environment, and we have these chairs here for you to come up and actively engage with the speakers and with the material. This is hard and important work. It's beautiful work and inspiring, and we're going to be open with Leon and Miriam with some really great ideas and great way of seeing the world. We didn't print an agenda. The agenda's over here. Bathrooms are back in there. There's a little bit of breakfast items. It's a little hard to come and go as you please with this setup, and it's the best that this is the way we wanted to create it. So, captive audience. Thank you for being here. Introduce Dr. Reverend Leon Dunkley. Thank you.
Good morning. How are you? My name is Leon Dunkley. I minister to a church, the North Chapel Church, the Unitarian Universalist Church here in Woodstock. It's really good to see you. Hi. There's some faces that I recognize. I went to a conference in 2006 in Texas, in Fort Worth, Texas, and there were people wearing buttons, on their hats, on their backpacks, all over the place, on their lapels. And the button said, the most radical thing we can do is introduce ourselves to one another. The most radical thing we can do is introduce ourselves to one another. After we introduce ourselves to one another, it's harder to imagine one another as enemy. There's a hymn in our hymnal at the church that we use sometimes. It's called Circle Round for Freedom, and the words are these. Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace. for all of us imprisoned. Circle for release. Circle for the planet. Circle for each soul. For the children of our children make the circle whole. Okay. There's a minister who is a friend of mine. His name was Rick Maston. He passed away maybe 15 years ago or so. I met him when I was in my teens at a conference center, and we became friends. He died of pancreatic cancer. When I was in seminary, he came to visit the seminary, and he was presenting in one of the classes. I went down into one of the classes, and I was in the seminary, and the teacher from the class said, "Would you come in? You're going to love this speaker," you know. And I was like, "Who is it?" And said, "I'll show you." And there was one chair left, and I sat down next to Rick, and I recognized him, of course, and he slapped my knee really hard and says, "Gosh, it's good to see you." And I knew him since I was a kid, so I slapped his leg back and I said, "Good to see you too," and horrified the professor. But Rick is a good friend, and he wrote a poem called "The Prisoners." And the words are these: "Though I have seen photos of those rugged, weary men, still I think I envy them, the prisoners, caught and confined in some good and holy war, which every war has been. Stubbornly clinging to secret information for which I'd rather die than tell, caught in a roach and rat-infested cell, my eye fixed on that thin sliver of light, the crack of hope that keeps us alive in this solitary confinement. Yes, I have hoped that, how did that go? In the solitary confinement. Yes, there have been days when I hoped that I wished it were a simpler prison, for out here in Woodstock, in this bright field of sunshine, it is far, far more difficult to plan the great escape." Okay, so I'm bringing these poems up to try to imagine the ways in which not they are imprisoned, but we are imprisoned from one another. Whether those prison bars be actual bars or just the sort of confinements that we can create for ourselves. Rick would say that, last thing is that Cornel West would say that he looks around the world and he doesn't see a cause to be optimistic because things are becoming increasingly difficult, especially when it comes to the prison industrial complex, how things are falling out with violence from uniformed officers on and off duty, in and outside of our own homes. He says he does not have cause to feel optimistic, but he remains a prisoner of hope. Okay? So if freedom means anything at all, it is a chance to choose one's own prison, a chance to ask to what ends is one willing to dedicate one's life? To what ends are we willing to dedicate our lives? Or more intimately, to what ends are you willing to dedicate your life? I've been struggling with a question that about how to hold two things at once. And I want to read a quote to you. I'm not going to tell you where the quote comes from, but I want to read a quote about that idea. The author writes, "I was situated at that moment in the turning of the northern year, when the end of winter and the start of spring overlapped like shingles on a roof, and the natural world seems doubled in thickness and density. A slight shift in the direction of the wind cools the air a single degree, and suddenly a puddle of standing water is covered with a thin skin of ice that seconds later, as that same wind parts the clouds and opens the sky, melts in the sunlight. At that moment, all is change. Transformation seems permanent. I was trembling with a kind of excitement that I had never felt before, a powerful mixture of anticipation and regret, as if I somehow knew that eternal gain and irretrievable loss were about to be parceled out equally, as if the idea of justice were about to be made a material thing." This quote is from a book called Cloud Splitter, which is Russell Banks' book that he dedicated to John Brown. It's told in the voice of Owen Brown, John Brown's surviving son, who leaves Harper's Ferry in West Virginia and runs to the hills of California, where he remains for the rest of his life. Sort of escaped from in the aftermath of the raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown made a decision and dedicated his life and took action famously in 1859 in Harper's Ferry. He took action infamously in 1859, and before that, murderously, he took action. But it's incomplete for us to focus on John Brown alone. The forces against which he fought were certainly murderous. Okay? Justice, always, but certainly in our time, depends on a faithful consideration of the whole. Russell Banks, in this book, invites us to break out of the narrowness of our own thoughts and stories, to break out of the confines of our own imagination. And the second and final quote I wanted to read to you comes from the beginning, page 6 of this book. Once Owen Brown is escaped to California, a young graduate student comes knocking on his door, graduate student from Columbia, New York. And she wants to learn the story of John Brown. Okay? And Owen screams at her and horrifies himself not having heard his own voice in years. So the book is basically an apology letter to this student he offended. And so, don't write Owen Brown. But he says this: was my father mad? Was my father mad? I realize that this is the only question that can matter to you. Since they first heard his name, men and women have been asking it. They asked it continuously during his lifetime, even before he became famous. Strangers, loyal followers, enemies, friends, and family alike. It was then and is now no merely academic question, and how you and your professors answer it will determine to a considerable degree how you and whoever reads your book will come to view the long and savage war between the white race and the black race on this continent. If the book that your good professor is presently composing, though it contain all the known and previously unknown facts of my father's life, cannot show and declare once and for all that old John Brown either was or was not mad, then it will be a useless addition to the head-high pile of useless books already written about him. For more than the facts of my father's hectic life, the people do need to know if he was sane or not. For if he was sane, then terrible things about race and human nature, especially here in North America, are true. If he was insane, then other, quite different, and perhaps not so terrible things about race and human nature are true. So I just want to invite you into a gentle and intimate consideration, encouraging your critique, your compassion, and the complexity of your thought as we enter a conversation about the idea of transformative justice. And enter into a discussion of creating a future that lay beyond prisons.
So we're grateful to have Vermont ACLUs here. It's my pleasure to introduce James and Ashley, who I will let introduce themselves because I'm sure they're more practiced in that than I am. But we're so grateful that you are here. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi.
I'm James Duff Lyle. I'm the director at the ACLU of Vermont. This is Ashley Sawyer, who is working with the ACLU's Campaign for Smart Justice. We are here to talk about that campaign, and then so we'll talk a little bit about the context for the campaign itself, sort of what we've done this year and in Vermont and where we're going from here. And then we're going to try and leave about 15-20 minutes for questions and discussion. I'm going to hand it off to Ashley to give a little bit of the kind of historical context, some of which Miriam touched upon, but to pick that up a little bit before bringing it back to Vermont and what's happening on the ground here in Vermont specifically. But before I do that, I guess I would just emphasize at the outset, we're here to talk about the ACLU's campaign and our work, but I just really want to underscore that our work is part of a much broader effort that has been going on for a very long time and will be going on for a very long time. And by activists and community members here in this room, around the state and around the country, criminal justice reform is a big, broad effort. The campaign that we're about to talk about is with campaign partners, grassroots organizations across the state. So it's not just us doing this work. I just want to, we come to you to talk about this work with humility and respect for all of the work that others like Miriam and so many others are doing every day to address these issues. So with that, I will hand it over to Ashley to give a little bit of context for our campaign.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Ashley Sawyer. I'm currently a consultant with the ACLU. I am also a directly impacted woman in the state of Vermont, so I am a convicted felon. So as Miriam mentioned earlier, the white folks that we're putting in jail for heroin addiction, I would be that white heroin addict that got imprisoned for my true crime of addiction. So just to give some context about who I am and the view I have of this work. And I don't want to get into a lot of, sort of national historical context because I think she did a really great job. But I want to read you one quote from 1970. The National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice Standards and Goals issued a recommendation that said, no new institutions for adults should be built, and existing institutions for juveniles should be closed. There is overwhelming evidence that these institutions create crime rather than prevent it. And that was from 1970. So the reality that we went from about 375,000 people incarcerated throughout the entire country to 2.3 million people today. This is research done in the 70s, so imagine what we know today. So the reality is that nationally, as you heard Miriam talk about, we are in an incarcerative state. That we incarcerate people for pretty much everything, like you heard her talk about mental health, addiction, immigration, poverty, and then we keep people locked in those cycles. So, nationally we know that people who come out of prisons face 50,000 legal hurdles to employment, to housing, to education. How do they then provide for those children? She was talking a lot about parents and children. So we've got kids that are sort of funneled to prison from school, discriminately and in horrific amounts, children of color. It's also happening to sort of the white children who are poverty-stricken, who have parents with addiction issues, who come from broken homes. So when the mass incarceration started, it was a way we ended slavery, and then there's a loophole in the 13th Amendment, right? That says basically you can no longer have slaves unless they're criminals. So if they've been convicted of a crime and they're in prison, you can exploit their labor, you don't have to pay them, you don't have to give them the same rights as other employed people, and you can use that labor however you'd like and for as long as you'd like. And that is still in the 13th Amendment today. So we still have people in jail doing labor for companies, for organizations, et cetera, getting paid 10 cents an hour, 25 cents an hour. There was recently a national prison strike for the workers in prisons to strike to say, wait a minute, This is 2018. If you're going to force us to work, we deserve the same stuff as everybody else gets, at least minimum wage, if nothing else, right? So, you know, nationally, you know, we read that quote in 1970, we look at the 13th Amendment and how we sort of built in this loophole and how, you know, inmates and people who are incarcerated are exploited for reasons of, like she was talking about, so it's really an economic system. So the question then became, well, what do we do about it? So now it's 2018, we have way more research, we know way more about how things work, why crimes are committed, how people stay stuck in this cycle, and how people of color especially are locked into this cycle, right? So once you go to, right, you have a parent, let's say you have a parent, okay, they're a person of color. Well, we know that they're more targeted by police. We know that that creates interaction with the criminal justice system, so then they can't get a job or a very high-paying job. So then they're stuck sort of getting assistance, and now they have a child. So now this child is living in poverty with parents who are struggling and who did not, you know, not even anything sometimes, just based on the color of their skin. And now those children perpetuate that cycle because they grow up and then they go to school and then they're locked in that same cycle. So the question really became, what do we do about it and why is it a problem? And what do we do about it in Vermont? Because just to clarify, Vermont has the worst racial disparity in the nation. So a lot of people go, wait, whoa, hold on. This is Vermont, we're mostly white, how does that happen? So we're gonna explain a little more about how that happens. Go for
How
it.
does that happen?
And why do we need smart justice?
And why do we need smart justice? Yeah, so, I mean, picking up off of that, I think it's really important to recognize that, you know, we talk about the U.S. as the leading jailer in the world and mass incarceration blowing up through the 70s and 80s, you know, for a number of factors, including the war on drugs, and the tough on crime era that we're still slowly coming out of. But Vermont is part of that. Vermont is not isolated from or unique or special. Vermont's prison population is currently triple what it was in the 1980s, and as Ashley mentioned, we have some of the worst racial disparities in our criminal justice system in the country. And that's, you know, per capita. That's not, oftentimes we throw out that statistic in front of mostly white, liberal, sympathetic audiences, and nothing we say generates more defensiveness or skepticism from an audience in Vermont than saying we have these massive racial disparities in our prison system, which, you know, unfortunately I think is telling. People don't really want to believe that, but the statistics are there and they've been there for quite some time. They're also totally consistent with the statistics we have on school discipline and suspensions, where students of color are 2 to 3 times more likely to be disciplined in Vermont schools across the state. Same consistent with the data we have from police showing people of color 2 to 3 times more likely to be stopped and searched by police, even though they're less likely to be found to have done anything wrong. And so it is not by accident that these disparities exist in our prison system here in Vermont, just as in the rest of the country. So Vermont's not special. This is real. The numbers are lower because it's a small state, but the trends and the incarceration rate and the disparities are all here with us. And that's the result, you know, of policies, of criminal justice policies that have been set, including drug policies, including sentencing policies. Our sentences have gotten longer and longer and longer for across the board for many crimes, serious and non-serious crimes. The good news is that Vermont's prison rate in recent years is in decline. Here's a chart showing sort of what happened through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and in the last few years, our incarceration rate has started to go down because of changes in policies. Because I think a growing number of policymakers and attorneys, states' attorneys, and community members have recognized that things have really gotten out of control, long since gotten out of control. And so they started changing policies. You know, and so we can do that. We can actually change the policies that have gotten us into this mess and go back to a system that is not so excessively and extremely punitive and really move towards a world like what Marianne was describing, a world where prisons are not seen as the solution to all social ills. So that's the context within which the ACLU's Smart Justice campaign was launched. Again, recognizing this work, the ACLU and many, many others have been doing this work for a very long time. But in an effort to really try and take advantage of shifting public attitudes around the criminal justice system, a move away from the very punitive, kind of knee-jerk, tough-on-crime reactions of decades past, and to really build on the growing awareness that there are far better alternatives and far better ways to deal with social problems than to rely on our police and prisons. So we are trying to make a concerted effort to really, put the pedal to the metal on criminal justice reform. Not reformist reform, but non-reformist reform. I loved that distinction. That was really wise. But really to make a concerted effort and to throw a lot of the ACLU's efforts and energies and resources behind the work of many community partners to massively reduce our prison population. So this is part of a national ACLU campaign. We have it in all 50 states with a goal of an initial goal of reducing our current prison population by 50%. And I would say that's not an end goal, but it's a starting goal to show that we can actually do this. We believe that with some very clear policy changes and changes in attitudes and approaches, we can absolutely achieve a 50% reduction of 2.3 million prisoners nationwide. And here in Vermont, we want to be the first state to reduce our prison population of 1,700 by half and eliminate the racial disparities that, as we say, are some of the worst in the nation. So we launched Smart Justice Vermont as part of the national campaign in January. A lot of the work so far has been looking at the policy proposals that are on the table. At any given legislative session, there are dozens of criminal justice reform bills. Some of which gain traction and take off, some of which just sort of languish and don't go anywhere because there's not enough support and demand behind them. And so, we need to change that. The policies, some of the bills are drafted and just sitting there, ready for somebody to support them and move them forward, and for legislators to hear that they're priorities for the public and for their constituents. And so a lot of this, not all of it, but a lot of this campaign is looking at changes in policies or looking at the legislature. At the last session, a big focus was on bail reform, trying to end the punitive use of bail that results in people going to prison pre-trial simply because they personally do not have the resources to cover a high bail amount, and for no other reason. And that still happens. About 400 people, give or take, on any given day are held in DOC custody in Vermont pre-trial. Many, not all, but many of them because they don't have the resources to cover bail. So bail reform was a big push. Last session, we got a very modest bail reform bill through. It, honestly, far more modest than we advocated for, and so there's still work to do there. There are bills looking at compassionate release or second look for people who've been in prison, senior citizens who've been in prison for decades, recognizing that continuing to warehouse them decades into a sentence is not necessarily in anyone's interest. Theirs, the communities, the taxpayers, anybody's. There are bills to address the fact that more than 100 people are held in DOC custody because DOC's determined that they lack adequate housing to be released to. And so more than 100 people today are in prison past their minimum release date. If they had a mansion to go home to, they would be out. But because they don't have adequate housing, the adequate housing that DOC is providing them at taxpayer expense is a prison cell. So there's legislation that would address that. There's a number of pieces. There's not going to be any one magic bullet solution that's going to cut our prison population in half or further. But there are a lot of policy proposals. So a lot of what we're trying to do is get out there and educate people about the campaign, about these issues, and encourage them to engage with us, engage with grassroots organizations in their community who are working on these issues, and to engage with their representatives, their elected representatives, and to make them understand that this is a priority, that this has to change. Another non-legislative aspect of this campaign that I'll just touch on briefly before handing the mic back to Ashley is this being an election year. We've been doing a lot of work around the role of state's attorneys in the criminal justice system, elected prosecutors. So that's another thing Miriam referenced, the tremendously powerful role that prosecutors play in a criminal justice system where 96% of cases end in a plea agreement proffered by a prosecutor to a defendant, never goes to trial. That leaves a huge amount of discretion and power and leverage with prosecutors. And yet, far too many people don't know that fact, that these people are extremely powerful and have a huge amount of influence and determine incarceration rates at, county by county, state by state, to an enormous degree. Many people don't know that these are elected officials. Many people don't know who their local state's attorney is. And many people don't know what positions their local state's attorney or state's attorney candidates have on any of these issues. And that has to change. That if we're going to achieve a significant decarceration, state's attorneys have to be a big part of that. And so engaging people in the electoral process and getting people in an election year to look at the candidates and what their positions are, but then even after the election to continue to engage with state's attorneys who are elected representatives, just like your elected state senator, state representative, your local state's attorney has a lot of power. And so if you care about criminal justice reform, it is really important to be following what that person is doing and that they hear from you, that, the sort of tough on crime, overly punitive approach to criminal justice is not what communities in Vermont want and need. So that's another big aspect of this campaign, is getting involved in the local elections for state's attorneys and talking about the critical role that elected prosecutors play. Those are a couple of aspects of Smart Justice Vermont. Again, this is in partnership with organizations and communities across the state. And I'll say a little bit more about sort of what the campaign is going to be doing going forward after the election and going into the next biennium. And then we can talk about that, but before we do that, I'll hand it back to Ashley.
Yeah, I have the ball now.
All right.
Talking a little bit about some of the things Duff said, like, how many people we incarcerate here in Vermont, and sort of that really tough on crime, really lengthy sentencing problem that we face here. And, a couple points I always like to make is, and I use myself as an example, and I speak very openly and clearly about my story and always accept questions about it. So my 2 felonies were fraud-based charges. I cashed checks that weren't mine. I also have a couple misdemeanor charges of things like a trespass, an attempted retail theft, a couple things like that. So that's sort of my criminal background, just so we all have the same information. But they attempted to give me a 2 to 6 year sentence to serve when I had never been in trouble before. I had never stepped foot in a prison. That was the sentence. So the judge found that unreasonable, and that I'm like 1 in a million where the judge says doesn't agree with the prosecutor. So I ended up with a 14-month to 4-year sentence to serve. So, and the reality is they knew I was an addict, right? They knew that I didn't just wake up one day sort of and go do this. It was, I was dealing with addiction, and I was trying to keep food on the table, and I had children, and I was trying to, deal with my addiction. Treatment wait lists at that time were 2 years. So, they knew that there was sort of this snowball effect going on in my life. But prosecutors don't look at that. There are thousands of cases that roll through the Vermont criminal justice system every month, every other month. There's just so many. And so when 97% of them end in plea deal, and there's so many people coming in and out, right? We know that public defenders are trying their best, but they have so many cases. There isn't a lot of time to put a person and humanity and a story or any sort of context to what happened, right? So your community, your house, your children was not any safer because I sat in prison. None of you are any safer today because I sat in prison. You're safer today, and I'm more successful today because I have an amazing family who supported me afterwards, because I went back to school, because I found support. I have a great therapist. He was my therapist in jail, is still my therapist today. Because I had underlying trauma, right? And we don't look at that either. Vermont has this unique opportunity to make really effective change and to be a leader in this movement, because yes, we are a smaller state, and your state representative lives 3 doors down from you. Or you can call your state's attorney, and you probably want to, right, or 5, or you can call your state's attorney because, hey, you saw them at the grocery store, they know your first name, but that's how much access we have to our elected officials and how much our voice matters. And that's how we can get engaged in movements like this and make those phone calls and have those conversations. Because many of the women that I was locked up with, 87% approximately, were moms. So when you lock up a mom, you've now incarcerated their children as well. And what does that mean? So we know that children who have adverse childhood experiences are exponentially, right, more in danger themselves of being involved in addiction, incarceration, being suspended from school. So it's really about looking at the whole picture, and that's why these changes need to happen.
Great.
So what are we going to do next?
What are we going to do next? I mean, first, it's important to underscore, like, this is a long-term campaign. It took decades to get ourselves into this mess. We're not going to flip the switch overnight. We very much see the first stage of our campaign, which again, part of a much broader movement and struggle. But for our campaign in this first year, it's largely been about getting the word out and talking to people and coming to events like this. And Ashley and our community organizer Nico have been crisscrossing the state and doing just that. And we've learned a lot in the process. I mean, I think we've shared a lot of information, but we've also learned a lot ourselves. One of the things we've learned is that there is broad public support for major systemic criminal justice reform. We actually did some polling earlier in the year that shows more than 2/3 of Vermonters favor reducing Vermont's incarceration rate and replacing it with something else, increasing the use of alternatives. So, I mean, this is what people want. And I think a lot of policymakers, part of our job is to let policymakers know that their constituents are behind them if they enact smarter policies. And their constituents are not stuck in the tough on crime era of years past, where politicians would be falling all over themselves to see who could be tougher, who could throw the book harder at criminal defendants, regardless of what impact that had on society, on families, on communities. So a lot of it is about sharing information and sort of changing mindsets, including of policymakers, states' attorneys, and leaders across the state. The next step is turning that into action, engaging people in the work of changing policy. And so, I mean, it's going to be increasingly really important for people who care about these issues to help us engage elected officials in changing the concrete policies from what they are, from what have gotten us into this situation, into better policies. And so your elected officials need to hear from you. It's really, and we're going to be doing everything we can to facilitate that and to make that possible. We're going to be doing citizen lobbying trainings. We make liberal use of our email list. If you're not already on our free email list, I hope you'll go to our website and subscribe so that you can find out next steps for the campaign, including legislative actions when the legislature is back in session, or opportunities to engage with your local state's attorney, for example. And sort of as we go and as we learn more, we're going to be getting more and more specific. The ACLU is rolling out 50 state blueprints to really break down in detail what specific changes in policies could achieve, and we hope eventually will achieve, a 50% or more reduction in our incarceration rate. So we're going to be coming up with increasingly detailed policy proposals, including, in the upcoming year or two, sentencing reform is going to be a huge one here in Vermont. There is a sentencing commission that was set up by the legislature to look at this entire sentencing scheme in Vermont and consider whether those sentences are appropriate and in the best interests of Vermont communities. And I think our short answer is no, they're not. They're extremely long. They're insanely long. If you look at other Western democracies, you look at other countries, and the length of sentences for comparable crimes, the United States over the last several decades has ratcheted up those sentences again and again and again and again, to the point that Vermont now has, I think, per capita, the second oldest and second most expensive prison population. We have people who've been in there for a very long time or are going to be in there for a very long time, even though the research shows, and actually he's right, we have more and more research showing that there are real diminishing returns to keeping people in cages for decades upon decades upon decades, and it actually makes matters worse. And 90% of these people are eventually going to come out. And the question is, are they going to come out in a position to succeed and contribute to their communities, or are they going to come out worse off than they were when they went in? And so far, we haven't changed that. And so sentencing reform is going to be huge. And it sounds, kind of technical, and some of these policy proposals can be dry, but the basic idea is we warehouse people in cages for far too long. And we really need to roll back those policies. And there's an opportunity to do that in the next couple of years with the recommendations of a sentencing commission coming next fall.
James, you might direct people to the BLS State's Attorney's Forum so they can see it.
Thank you. Yeah, so we hosted with Vermont Law School a State's Attorney Forum. This is part of our work to draw attention to the role of state's attorneys in an election year. So you can see in some of the counties where there are contested races, not every county has a contested state's attorney race. You can go and see you can watch the debate that happened a few months ago, before the primary. And you can also go to our website where we have a voter guide that includes the positions not just of all of the state's attorneys currently running, but also all of the attorney general and gubernatorial candidates currently running. We ask them about their positions on criminal justice reform. I definitely encourage people to go and read up on your candidates and see where they stand on the issues and to engage with them. And then after the election, continue to engage with them on these issues. So, that's it in a nutshell in terms of where we are and where we're going. But other than that, I would, again, just really encourage people to plug into the work and to follow our work to engage in these issues. A lot of these solutions are small and incremental and local, but that means we all have a lot of opportunity and a lot of responsibility for changing them. And so we need your help to do that, and look forward to working with folks.
I'm really excited on behalf of the Woodstock Social Justice Initiative to welcome Professor Bobby Sand from the Center for Justice Reform at Vermont Law School. Please welcome Bobby Sand here.
Yes. What does it say that the two people who know me best left right before I started talking? So I am the director of the Center for Justice Reform and an associate professor at the Vermont Law School. Before I entered the academy, I was a prosecutor for 22 years, 16 as the elected Windsor County State's Attorney, the DA for this county. So I think I know enough about the criminal justice system to be really dangerous, which is sort of a joke and sort of not a joke. I want to try to do three things. One is put you to work and have you enter the world of the criminal justice system. The second is to talk about some new ways to think about conflict and harm. And the third is to see if we can fuse or merge these new ways with the conventional way. What we're going to start by doing is looking at this fact pattern. And before you read it, please, let me just say to you, it's a made-up case, but it does involve an act of violence in the home. And you don't have to read the sheet to participate in the exercise. Self-care is important. So if you think reading about this made-up case of violence within the home would not be good for you, don't read it. And if you think our discussion about it, which we will have, would not be good for you, then you might want to just step out for the first portion of this. So this is not designed to shock anyone, but take care of yourself. I do have more copies if anyone else would like a copy. And I'm going to give you all 2 minutes to do a quick read of the fact pattern. So if we were in court, and the criminal court in this county is down in White River, the judge would come out and the judge would say, we're here in the matter of State versus Jones. It's the court's understanding that Mr. Jones has elected to forego a jury trial and has instead chosen to enter a guilty plea to the charge of second-degree murder. The maximum possible penalty for that offense is life in prison. We'll now hear from the prosecution for a sentencing argument. And the prosecutor gets up and says, Your Honor, this is one of the most serious crimes that exists in Vermont. Crimes of this nature, murder, are deserving of substantial punishment. No matter how bad things were in the home, we cannot tolerate people taking the law into their own hands. Your Honor, use your sentence to punish Mr. Jones. Use your sentence to send a message to him that self-help is not acceptable. Use your sentence to send a message to the community that this behavior is not acceptable. And from the standpoint of public safety, this is a young man who, when he gets excessively stressed out, engages in self-help remedy. Public safety demands a significant period of incarceration. Judge says, thank you, and then asks the defense attorney. And the defense attorney gets up and says, Your Honor, Mr. Jones doesn't dispute that what he did was wrong. He immediately turned himself into the police. He understands he's going to be punished. But this was a unique situation within the home. It is not going to happen again. This is a young man with hope and promise who was trapped. He knows he's going to be punished, but don't ruin the rest of his life. Please exercise leniency in the consequences for Mr. Jones. And then the judge says, well, the court has to weigh the various factors that go into sentencing in this country. Retribution. Criminal acts are deserving of punishment. But we also have to look at deterrence. How can our sentence send a message to Mr. Jones? This behavior is not acceptable. How can we send a message to the general public that this behavior will not be accepted? We have to consider rehabilitation. What sentence will help Mr. Jones become a productive member of society? And then there is incapacitation. Removing people who are dangerous can help make the public safer. And as a result, it is the sentence of this court that Mr. Jones receive the following. Now, do we have any judges in this room? You are all now the sentencing judge for Edward Jones. You have the option to sentence him from 0 to life in prison. What I'd like every one of you to do is decide, if you were the sentencing judge under these facts, a second-degree murder case, how many years, how much time as an initial matter would you sentence Mr. Jones to? It could be 0. We could go all the way up to, we'll say, 99 years. You can use half-year increments if you would like. All I would like you to do is think about that initial period of incarceration, not supervision after the fact, not probation, not parole. How many years up front as an initial matter? Now, the number that you think determine and write down, no one's going to know it. Some of you have a blue card. I would like the holders of the blue card to write their number down on that blue card. Those two will be anonymous because I will collect them and I will shuffle them. All right, so a random group of maybe not a random audience. Let's see. 1 year. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 5, 0, 0, 1, 3, 1, 10, 0, 0, 5, 10, 0. So even with this group, who I suspect are almost universally reform-minded folks, we get a pretty wide range, right? 0 to 10. And what I want to say is, welcome to the American criminal justice system. So, and I promise you that with a different audience and a different lead-in to this presentation, the range would have been substantially different. So I've done this exercise, and rarely are there zeros. Oftentimes there's 20, 30, 40, 50 life imprisonment. Significant range. So what's important to understand is that legislatures in many states, including Vermont, sets a maximum possible penalty for offenses, and then there is extraordinarily broad discretion on the part of sentencing judges to decide what is a fair outcome. Now, what that means is that the personal perspective of the judge can heavily influence the outcome. The personal perspective of the prosecutor, who largely drives the criminal justice system, can heavily influence the outcome. In Vermont, we have 14 counties with a presiding judge in each county. Every single one of those judges has a different perspective about punishment. Some emphasize retribution more, some emphasize rehabilitation more. The judges in Vermont rotate annually or semi-annually. You never know who your sentencing judge is going to be. How that judge is feeling on a particular day, that can influence the outcome. There is some evidence that if judges are hungry, or in fact hangry, that can influence the outcome. There is an extraordinary amount of latitude and leeway in our system, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a really concerning thing, because biases, explicit or implicit, end up becoming such significant drivers of the criminal justice system. And we can't even agree on what are the important factors to consider. So this is the first time ever having this notebook has come in handy. So up in the triangle there, we have the offense, the maximum penalty, and the prior record. And those are the three factors that are always considered. What's the offense? What's the maximum possible penalty for that offense? And what's the prior record of the accused? And yet, we probably all realize that those factors are not enough for a fair consideration of what should happen. Right? So what if those factors are just the tip of the iceberg? And when we go down deeper, when we do a deeper dive, we start to consider, well, the wishes and desires of the mother. So we heard earlier Even people in abusive relationships might love their abuser. What if the mom, to all of you folks who said 0, what if the mom, notwithstanding the trauma of that home environment, deeply loved her husband and was furious, livid at her son for what he did? Would that change your perspective? Some say no, some say yes. What if the father, when he had been employed, was incredibly generous, was philanthropic in his behaviors? What if he grew up in a horrific home environment? Would that change your attitude? Maybe, maybe not. What I hope you realize is that to get the full picture, to do that deeper dive is incredibly important, but it makes it much more complicated. It makes it much more time-consuming. And we have a criminal justice system that perceives that it does not have a whole lot of time. Okay. Duff and Ashley talked earlier about the power of prosecutors in the system, and it really is the prosecutors who drive outcomes, both through their charging decisions and through their plea offers. And I hosted the debate that he referenced among the state's attorney candidates, and I asked the candidates at that debate, how are you going to account for implicit bias as the state's attorney? And every single one of the candidates said, well, of course police have implicit bias. My job as prosecutor is to look out for that and to try to screen it out. Not a single one of them acknowledged that they, of course, had implicit bias as well. And that's not surprising, that's not a condemnation, that is a reality. We all do. So let me tell you a story. Wrong slide. Sorry about that. So this is going to be hard to see. Totally as an aside, this is a picture of two folks who presented at the Vermont Law School. It's two justices of the Connecticut Supreme Court. It's the first African-born justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court and the new Chief Justice. And there is actually a historical first for the new Chief Justice. So this is the first African-born justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court and the new Chief Justice, and there's a historical first for the new Chief Justice. Can any of you guess what the new historical first is for the new Chief Justice? Tell your seatmate what you think the new historical first is for the new Chief Justice. So, sorry for those of you who may not be able to see. Just out of curiosity, how many of you say that the new historical first for the new Chief Justice is that she is a woman? I said that too. The underlying assumption, perhaps the implicit assumption, is that the person of color was born in Africa, and therefore the woman who is standing was the new Chief Justice. In fact, Justice Maria Khan was born in Angola, Africa. Justice Richard Robinson, the new Chief Justice, the first person of color to head the Connecticut Supreme Court, was born in Stamford, Connecticut. We all make assumptions. That's what makes us human. The challenge is to become better humans. Let me share with you a story about a new way to think about harm and conflict and crime. My brother lives outside of Boston. My sister lives outside of DC. I live very close by in Woodstock. Our mom lives outside New York City in Westchester County. And my brother, sister, and I decided to go visit our mom, and we didn't want to stay in a hotel, so we thought it'd be fun to rent a house. So I went on Airbnb, and I got a house for the weekend. We all met in Westchester, had a very nice visit with my mom, had an early dinner. My brother, sister, and I then went out for a more substantial meal after that. And I was frustrated that day because I hadn't gotten the code to figure out how to actually get into this house. And then finally during the meal, I get an email with the passcode. So we finish dinner, we go to the house, it's cold, drizzly, we're a little tired, and we walk up to the front door, and there's one of those boxes, and I type in the code, it pops open, there's a key, I hand the key to my sister who's by the front door, she opens the door, and there's a latch chain keeping the door from opening. So my sister says rats, my brother uses slightly different language, and I am tired and frustrated, and so with a fairly firm shove of my shoulder, I pop the door open, and in the process, the door trim was damaged. English professors, conscious use of passive voice there, right? So, my sister is appalled. My brother bizarrely thinks that's somehow cool. I'm tired, and I just go to bed. So in the morning, I do the right thing. I email the owner, and I say, thank you for the use of your lovely home. In the interest of full disclosure, when we arrived, there was a latch across the door, and in opening the door, the trim was damaged. In response, he goes ballistic. And how dare you do that? You had no right to do that. You had an obligation to contact me. How do I know you're not going to destroy my entire home? And I respond, I am sorry for the damage. Of course, you did have a responsibility to give us access to the home. He responds, all caps. Don't tell me about my responsibility. I'm a lawyer, blah, blah. I respond, well, I was a DA for 22 years and the elected prosecutor for 16 years, and I am a law professor, so blah, blah, blah. So we blah, blah back and forth quite a few times, and then finally he says, fine. I'm not going to make you pay for it. I'm going to pay for it, but I am reporting you to the police. So then I spend about 24 to 36 hours researching New York State law. What's the law of illegal entry say? Did I have a reasonable grounds for believing that I could go into the home? What's the contract Airbnb say? If I am going to be interviewed and arrested by the police, which police department was going to do that? So needless to say, I wasn't particularly present for the visit with my mom or my siblings. But after really about 2 days, my thinking starts to shift, and I start to see this problem through a different lens, largely influenced by a really important book called Changing Lenses by Howard Zehr. And I started to think, regardless of the legality of what I did I cause this person harm? The answer to that was yeah. And as a result of causing harm, did I have an obligation to try to address that harm? And I thought the answer to that was yes. And did I have a means to make amends? And the answer to that was yes. So when I got home, wrote a letter, and I wrote a check. And I had researched what I thought it would cost to repair the damage. And I sent him the letter and check, and I said, regardless of the legality of what I did, I caused you harm, and for that I am sorry. Enclosed, please find a check to repair the door, or the door trim, to the extent that the check exceeds the amount of the repair costs. I hope you'll consider donating it to charity. 4 days later, I get an email back from him, and he says, thank you so much for your letter. You have restored my faith in humanity. I am so sorry for the way that I overreacted. I thought that was the end, but about 45 days later, in the mail is a check returning 3/4 of the money that I had sent back to me. So I acknowledge that there is considerable privilege contained within this story. This was an Airbnb rental. I had the financial ability to make amends, I suspect, for a variety of reasons. If the police had shown up, I wasn't going to get arrested. But what I also know to be true is that as long as this situation was about rules and law and advantage and leverage, the conflict just continued to escalate. And once it became about harm and obligation and relationship and restoration, some measure of justice was achieved. And that's largely what restorative justice is about, a relational response to harm as opposed to a punitive response to harm. So how then can we take a new way of thinking about harm, a relational way of thinking about harm, and engraft it into, onto, merge it into or onto the more conventional criminal justice system? So our current system has many easy on-ramps to bring people into the criminal justice system, although some call it the criminal legal system, questioning whether justice is really done there. And while the on-ramp is a decent comparison, perhaps more compelling and honest is a conveyor belt. We have this extraordinarily well-oiled machine that funnels people into the criminal system. And we talk about putting people into cages, and I've certainly used that phrase. I was in the Springfield Southern State Correctional Facility 2 weeks ago, and in many respects we're putting people into boxes. And both options largely are unacceptable. So why is it, or how is it, that we are feeding this conveyor belt? Well, certainly police play a role in that, but they also have an extraordinarily difficult job with incredible time constraints, with incredible safety constraints. And law enforcement, their job is to enforce the laws that we, the people, are giving them. So are they a contributing factor? Sure, they're a contributing factor. Prosecutors, too, are a contributing factor. Probably not so much this guy, but primarily state prosecutors, because the vast majority of criminal offenses are prosecuted by state prosecutors, most of whom are elected, most of whom have a perspective on the criminal justice system that all of us have an obligation to understand. Judges feed the system as well, with bail decisions, with sentencing decisions, but really judges are responsive to cases filed by prosecutors. So I will say again, it really is the prosecutors who are driving the system. Now, not pictured here, but contributing folks to this machinery of the criminal justice system are our legislators. Notice how our two legislators left. I think that was coincidental. Oh, sorry, Mr. Kimball, he just moved. Thank you, Charlie, for your bravery. Legislators decide what is criminal and what is not, decide what the maximum possible penalty should be for offenses. And of course, lastly, we all bear responsibility. We have the ability to go to the ballot box and affect change. And we cannot simply be passive in the electoral process and then complain about the outcome. So, a few more specifics then. And let me just reiterate what Duff said. Discretion. It is extraordinary, the amount of discretion that we place into our prosecutors in particular. So when I was the Windsor County State's Attorney, our office reviewed approximately 2,000 cases a year. That's 2,000 instances where we got to have an extraordinarily profound impact on the lives of the people involved in those cases. Not just the potential defendants, but also victims and family members affected by that. So when you go to the ballot box, particularly for state's attorney, think about, is that person going to exercise discretion in a manner that you find appropriate and acceptable? So this is an off-ramp. So how do we create more off-ramps for the current criminal justice system? And perhaps more importantly, how do we keep people from ever entering? Because once you're on that conveyor belt, it becomes pretty challenging to come off. Okay, so first, we need to insist on geographic justice in Vermont. We have some really innovative programs in this state. So I was very proud as state's attorney to start the first DUI treatment docket. So this was a variant on the drug court model. When we started it, we were the only DUI treatment court in the state. We remain the only DUI treatment court in the state. We're a small enough place here that if there is something good in one county, we ought to be able to figure out how to create equity in other counties so that the off-ramp that exists in one place would also exist in another part of the state. Duff mentioned this. We need to figure out better measures of criminal justice success. I promise you, when I was a young state's attorney and someone said, "What are your biggest successes?" I would answer that by talking about some high-profile case that resulted in a conviction with a huge number of years of a person's life put in a box. That is just a lousy measure of success. Far more important are the people whose lives got turned around. But state's attorneys for decades have measured their own success by years of incarceration. I would commend to all of you a TED Talk by Adam Foss, F-O-S-S. Adam was a former assistant DA outside of Boston. He is a powerful speaker on creating new measures of success within the criminal justice system. We need better data, and we need the legislature to insist on better data. How do we know that what one prosecutor is doing is working or not? We're just blindly following recommendations of prosecutors and judges without analyzing whether it's really making our communities safer. I think most people in this room believe that more incarceration will actually equate to worse overall public safety outcomes. We need to be able to prove that. We need in this state more skin in the game in terms of sentencing, and here's what I mean by that. We have a centralized system in Vermont. So if someone gets sentenced to incarceration in Bennington County, or Orange County, or Windsor County, or Chittenden County, we all collectively pay for it. So what does that mean? That means in Windsor County, which historically has used correctional resources below its per capita level, we are underwriting the counties that are excessively using correctional resources. So I say we should do this. Every county should get an allocation of DOC, Department of Correction, resources. If any county wants to go above their per capita allocation, fine, but the county pays for it. I promise you, once the counties have to pony up to pay above their state allotment, the incarceration rates in those counties are going to plummet. And right now, there just is no accountability of that nature. How do we incentivize alternative approaches? So historically, prosecutors' offices in this state were allocated resources based upon the number of charges filed. That created a powerful incentive to file more charges. We haven't figured out how to reward and incentivize the use of alternative approaches. Now, I will say having an attorney general who strongly supports alternative approaches is helping. I will tell you that your state's attorney, David Cahill, is diverting 51% of the misdemeanor cases out of court. So the curve is starting to bend, but we haven't figured out how to create a financial incentive. I think we're working on a moral and ethical incentive, and that's important, but a financial incentive might push us a little bit farther, faster. Lastly, we need to teach a new generation of criminal justice leaders about new and different approaches to harm and conflict and crime. And I apologize for the shameless plug at the end of my talk, but Vermont Law School has just started a new Master of Arts in Restorative Justice. We're the first law school in the country that now offers not only a JD, a law degree, but also a restorative justice degree. And I hope, and I'm actually confident, that as we graduate new people who enter the criminal justice arena and elsewhere, understanding that there are alternatives to a punitive approach to harm and conflict and crime, that will begin to influence some change.